Hi, if you like the video, please remember to subscribe. Hi, I'm Rob from robmanphoto.com, and today I'm going to be doing a short video kind of as an introduction and a little bit of an explanation about probably the most common mode that you'll use your DSLR in, or even your film SLR, which is Aperture Priority Mode. So what's it all about? Why do we use it so much? And kind of how does it work? So once you've kind of decided that you've had enough of auto with your DSLR, when you're a little bit tired of the camera choosing which autofocus points to use, when the camera chooses to pop up the flash, when the camera chooses the shutter speed and all that sort of stuff, you think, oh, I want more creative control over my photography. Often the first step we take is to Aperture Priority Mode, which is AV on Canon cameras. I think it's the same on almost every other make at all as well. So, why should we make the step up to Aperture Priority Mode, and what does it do? Well, quite simply, when we're in Aperture Priority Mode, we're controlling the camera's aperture, which is the hole in the lens. So let me show you. I've brought this kind of lens down just to kind of show you a little bit better. So this is a manual lens, but it's an f1.8, so it has a really big aperture, so hole in the middle. So when I change the f-stops, can you see it? In fact, let me move it closer to the camera. See it changing? So when we're in Aperture Priority Mode and we're changing our f-stops, or we're changing, that number that goes normally from like, I don't know, f3.5 to f22, although we're doing it on the back of our cameras or on dials, physically in the lens, that's what's happening with little motors. It's going like that. It's going in and out, and it's letting us choose the size of that hole. So, why would we want to choose the size of the hole? Well, obviously, as we vary the size of that hole, we're letting in different amounts of light, aren't we? And there's also another feature, which is it affects the depth of field of our photos. So what that means is, if you're like at your widest aperture, say on this lens it's an f1.8, on my Canon 600D's kit lens it's f3.5. When we're at that widest aperture, the amount of scene that is in focus will be smaller than if we're at a bigger number. So what does that mean? So imagine you're taking a picture of a flower. So I've got a flower in front of me here. And what I want the background to be nice and out of focus, a little bit blurry. So the aperture I would choose would be a large aperture, something like that, which funnily enough is a smaller number. So with this lens it would be an f1.4. With this lens it would be an f3.5. So if I dial it to f3.5 and then I take my picture with the lens cap off, click, then what I should get is a nice sharp flower with the background nicely blurred. If I wanted to do the opposite, say I wanted to see the background, say I was taking a landscape shot with the flower in the foreground, but I wanted everything to be in focus behind, I would choose a smaller f-stop. So, with this lens, I would stop down to, I think it's f16 is the smallest aperture on this particular lens. I think on this one it's f22. So I'd probably, stop down to f16, or probably not f22, because there's other issues when you go really tight, and then do the same thing, focus on the flower, take the picture, and generally most of the scene will be in focus. And that's the artistic choice we have with Aperture Priority Mode, because although we're choosing the aperture, what the camera's doing, which is really clever, is it's selecting the shutter speed to make an acceptable exposure, so the photo is going to be looking really good. So we can just wander around with our cameras looking at the scene and thinking, okay, well actually I want quite a lot of the scene in focus, so I'm going to choose maybe f16 or f8, or I want a really tight focus, and so a small depth of field, so I'm going to be at f3.5, f2.8 or f1.8 if you're lucky enough to have lenses like that. So it's a real simple way of us controlling the look and feel of our photographs in Aperture Priority Mode. Now, a couple of other things as well. The dangers of Aperture Priority Mode is your shutter speed getting too slow if you're hand holding. So wandering around and taking photos, make sure you're looking at on the back of the camera or in the viewfinder what your shutter speed is, because when you do stop down, as we call it, to those smaller those bigger F numbers like F16, F8, F22, there's a lot less light coming into your camera, and so your shutter speed has to go up. And that could mean that all of a sudden your shutter speed, instead of being at like a 2/50th of a second or 1/125th, starts creeping down to a 50th, 20th of a second. And remember, that could lead to camera shake. Now we have image stabilization, lots of our lenses, but you want to minimize the chance of getting a shock because of camera shake, or maybe even your subject moving if it's like a field or something like that of corn, or even trees in the middle of it, don't they? So keep an eye on that. And if you are, for example, taking a shot where you want lots of the scene in focus, and you're down at f16, and you notice your shutter speed's cropped down, and your hand holding gone down to, I don't know, like a 15th of a second or a 30th of a second, so you're getting a bit nervous, obviously you can put your camera on a tripod, but that won't stop things blowing in the wind. Or you can increase your ISO, so go into the settings, bump the ISO up, and as that ISO number gets bigger, 200, 400, 1800, 1600, etc., the camera becomes more sensitive to light, so the shutter speed will get faster. So that's a really good sort of tip there, so keep an eye on it. Now, the other things really about Aperture Priority Mode that I kind of believe actually is that, bear in mind this phrase, F8 and B there. Okay, it's a phrase that photojournalists used to use a lot. And what it means is don't get too hung up on which aperture you should use when you're wandering around and taking photographs. If you're just generally wandering around and taking pictures of things, stick your camera on f8. That will probably be in what we would call the sweet spot of the lens. So if you can imagine each lens, especially zoom lenses, they have apertures in this one 3.5 to 5.6, I think it is. And when they're building these lenses, it's basically a compromise between where you're going to get the sharpest pictures at different apertures. And generally speaking, f8s can be pretty good. The lens will be pretty sharp there. Or it could be maybe something like f5.6. But for just general wandering around shooting on a day where it's fairly sunny day, fairly normal day, f8. Let the camera sort out the shutter speed. If you're lucky enough to have a camera with auto ISO, you can put auto ISO on as well, and then the camera will adjust the ISO to make sure your shutter speed don't go too slow. But again, keep an eye on that particular on your shutter speed to make sure it's not creeping down, especially if all of a sudden you've got moving subjects like, I don't know, people wandering around, or cars or bicycles or animals and things like that, because then you want to take more control that way. There are disadvantages to Aperture Priority as well. As I said, the fact that your shutter speed could go a little bit long. But also remember that we're still relying on the camera to sort out the exposure. So if we're in a tricky lighting situation, say someone's backlit, say you've got a subject in front of you, portrait, and the sun is behind them, so it's very, very bright, your camera will see that brightness, and your camera will then compensate for that, and it will make your subject in the front go very underexposed, so very dark. They'll basically turn into a silhouette. So that's where your exposure compensation comes into. Again, consult your manual, but basically you press the exposure compensation and you'll dial in plus or minus. And what you're telling the camera is, I know you think this is the brightness that you should set the exposure to, but I'm telling you to do it a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. So if your subject's backlit and it's a portrait, what you'll want to do is you want to brighten that photo up to make sure that they become acceptably exposed, and that can be a really, really pretty look as well. Or it could be the other thing where you've got a very, very dark background, somebody in the foreground who is quite bright, and they might go too bright because it's trying to lighten up that black background. So again, dial the exposure compensation down. The final thing I want to mention about Aperture Priority Mode is that often we equate small numbers, so f3.5, f2.8, f1.8, f1.4, to small depth of field, which I mentioned the fact that, that the example with the flower. So if you sit there and you've got a flower and you want the background to be able to focus, you'd set your aperture to f3.5, f2.8, f1.8, one of those smaller numbers which gives you the big hole. And then your flower will be nice and sharp and the background will be out of focus. However, there is often a more effective and a better way of achieving that look. And the way that you do this can be a little bit counterintuitive, but what you do is you take your wide angle zoom off, your 18 to 55, you know, that lens that came with your camera, you probably use 99% of the time, get it off the camera. And I'm not telling you to go and buy like a 50mm 1.2 or a 50mm 1.4, because you can get an amazing small depth of field shots, which is often what we're looking for in Aperture Priority Mode with one of these babies. This, you've probably got this already, this is your Telephoto Zoom. And you may well be saying, well, wait a minute, if my subject's fairly close to me, like a flower or a person, surely I'd be using my wide angle, wouldn't I? Well, the answer is no. Because depth of field is a bit of a thorny subject. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of how it works, but basically, with a telephoto zoom, you can make the depth of field appear to be a lot smaller than it actually is, because what a telephoto does is it brings that blurred background closer, it makes it bigger, so the background looks more blurred. Now, it isn't actually more blurred for a given distance and then a given aperture, but it appears to be that way, and that's all you need to worry about. So, for example, if I was in that same position again, where I had a flower, you know, and I wanted the flower to be nice and sharp, but I wanted the background to be nice and out of focus, I would get my kit lens off the camera. I would get my telephoto zoom. This happens to be the 55 to 250 IS. So it's a nice budget telephoto, and this is what you would do as well. You zoom out all the way, because this lens has a macro function, and your telephoto zoom probably has the same thing, but it does its macro function at the long end, and then you can focus on your close subject, and it's amazing how close these lenses will focus. It's totally counterintuitive, and you will get amazing, what we would call bokeh or out of focus shots behind, for the flower example. The other real common example of that as well is for people shots and portrait shots. You know, you may think when somebody's fairly close to you, say, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet away, you should carry on shooting with your 18 to 55. You might even a little bit with it, you know, have it at 55mm. But if you want that small depth of field look, get your zoom on there and back off a little bit as well. Get further away from your subject if you can, if the room and the space allows, and zoom in. And although you may be looking in your viewfinder and it will say you're at f5.6 or you're at f8 or at f11, when you take the photos and you actually look at them on the back of your screen or when you get home on the computer, you'll be amazed at the kind of short depth of field look you get with a telephoto zoom, even a budget telephoto zoom, by moving further away from your subject and then zooming in so you've got the same framing. And it can be very effective indeed. And often it's much more flattering, well, all the time, it's much more flattering to take pictures of people with one of these guys zoomed in than wrong lens, than with an 18 to 55. So there we go. That's my sort of short little guide to Aperture Priority Mode. Give it a go. Get your camera manual out and read it about, you know, how to turn Aperture Priority Mode on, and then basically just select Aperture Priority Mode. If you're out on a sunny day, you know, dial in ISO 100 or 200 or turn ISO auto ISO off and have a wander around and shoot at f8 and let the camera worry about everything. If you're in a tricky situation, use exposure compensation. If you suddenly think, oh, I want a short depth of field, you know, get your kit lens off and put your telephoto zoom on, and you'll be amazed at what you can do. Okay, so that's it from me. If you like the videos, please subscribe. It really does help. Put comments in the comment section down below. You can email me. My name's Rob from robnunphoto.com, and my email address is scalespeeder@gmail.com, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.